Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and I'm going to conclude my segment on race and ethnicity today. And I want to return to something I began with in the first, which is my statement that if you believe that biological races exist, you are, by my definition, a racist. And I want to unpack that a little more because you can easily misunderstand what I mean by that. I don't mean that you have any prejudice against people of various races that you identify. And I'm not saying that because I don't believe that biological races exist, that somehow I'm immune to prejudice. I don't mean that either. Let's just get to unpacking what I actually mean. Now I'm going to give you a concept from social science called a social construct. Something is a social construct that exists in the minds of people in the culture, regardless of whether that thing physically exists. And what I'm going to say is that race is a social construct. Very, very important example of a social construct is money. The piece of paper that has $10 on it, or $50 on it, or $100 on it, is not in any physical sense worth that amount of money. It's worth that amount. When I say that amount of money, you can buy certain things, you can exchange that note for certain things because people have faith in the value of that note. But that note has no intrinsic value. And even if a currency were pegged to the gold standard, that means that if you were to go to the bank in a country that has the gold standard and you have a, let's say a one ounce note, let's say, in that country that means that you could exchange that note for 1 ounce of gold. But you're only pushing the concept of value one step back. Why does gold have the value it has? It has the value it has because of social agreement. Same with diamonds. Actually, diamonds are incredibly plentiful the world over. Gold is incredibly plentiful. But companies like De Beers with diamonds, for example, historically limited the amount of diamonds and gold on the market to make sure that its value remained high. So value itself is a social construct. If we lived in a barter system, then things would be simple. I have this many bananas. I would like some eggs. Well, what are bananas worth to me? What are eggs worth to me? What are they worth to you? And so on, and we can work it out that way. The reason that humans invented money was because barter is inefficient. But money is just a construct. I mean, I always remember how strange it felt when I moved from getting a check every month from my university to direct deposit. Direct deposit is very abstract. Like a certain set of binary numbers in my checking account are increased and they are decreased in some fund in New York, and therefore I have so many thousand more dollars which I can then spend, usually with a debit card, into a machine, so that I go to the supermarket and certain binary figures are taken out of my my bank account and placed in the supermarket's bank account. It's all very, very abstract. It's a system of faith. And what I'm getting at is that race is the same way. That what races there are is determined in large part on what culture you were brought up in. So that, for example, if you were brought up in the United States, then one of the key divides is going to be between white and black, or between European and African. And then if you are in certain parts of the country, particularly the West Coast, then an Asian population, particularly Chinese, but also Japanese, may come into the mix. But what you're taught about race as you're growing up is determined by what you see around you. And of course, nowadays things are changing enormously, because people in the United States are beginning to see people from India, from Pakistan, maybe from Arabian countries. And so their traditional racial categories are being challenged when they see Vietnamese or Hmong in Louisiana for the first time. They don't really know where to put them. You know, they know where to put African people because they know about descendants of slaves. They know about white people, the descendants of European immigrants. But Hmong or Vietnamese, who are very recent immigrants, don't fit those racial categories. And what I'm getting at is that what you think of as race is given to you by your upbringing, by what you see around you. So growing up in Australia, things were pretty simple. At the time that I lived there, they had what was called the White Australia policy, which had been enforced since the early part of the 20th century to prevent islanders, particularly from Micronesia and Melanesia, from being brought in as cheap labor for the sugarcane fields and so forth in the northern part of the country, particularly Queensland, that they had outlawed anybody of color being allowed to immigrate and work in Australia. And that meant that when I went there with my family, we were okay because we were white, but there were no other types of immigrants. The only people of color were Aborigines, and they were routinely discriminated against. They couldn't live in the same streets as people of European descent. They couldn't buy alcohol. They couldn't go into bars. Don't think they could own property. Not sure of all the rules, but basically what was presented to me growing up as race was Australians, meaning like the colonial immigrant population, all essentially Europeans of one sort or another, and Aborigines, and no Asians, no Africans. So my concept of race growing up was really limited. And as I mentioned, I think last time, in Argentina, there are three broad categories: rubio, moreno, and negro. And negro really doesn't exist anymore because of the genocides in the 19th century. So you're either rubio, white, me, or moreno, brown, which encompasses mestizo, which could be all kinds of mixtures of Spanish and native South American, and possibly also African. So what I'm getting at is that race very clearly does exist as a social construct, not as a biological fact, but as a social construct. But what counts as race is determined by the culture that you live in, and the value placed on particular socially constructed races is determined by a whole slew of factors. Now here in Cambodia, I'm just labeled foreigner, and that is not Asian. Most of the people here are either Khmer, and they're fairly easily identifiable, or Chinese. Now in most Asian countries, most people who are born here can identify fairly clearly the difference between, say, Japanese and Korean and Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai and Khmer, and so forth. Not 100%, but fairly accurately. But the interesting thing is it's not done according to biology. It's done more according to behavior. That is, I can fairly quickly identify Japanese people because of the things they do, and to some extent their demeanor as well, and the clothes that they're wearing. But I can't identify them just by looking at their physical features, or Koreans or Chinese either. In fact, I can't really identify Koreans very easily because I'm not familiar with Korea, but I am familiar with China and with Japan. And so I can identify those people fairly simply. So here, the racial categories that are common and the prejudices and all the rest of it that are common in the United States just don't exist. The prejudices here are completely different, but they do still exist. There are plenty of prejudices, but they are not geared towards African versus European. You know, when people look at me, they always ask, where are you from? And I usually tell them I'm from Argentina, which doesn't help much. I usually have to say, you know, the country where Messi or Maradona, they're two very famous football players. You know, if I say Messi or Maradona, they say, oh, okay, I understand. And that kind of puts me in my correct category. But generally speaking, people look at me here and they just say, foreigner. That's it. That's all that matters. And so there's a category here of Khmer, and there are also ethnic minorities in Cambodia. And one of them is Vietnamese, but there's also a small, very old Muslim population, the Cham. There are a few ethnic minorities, and the Chinese, and then I am in a very, you know, not despised, but not particularly welcome category either, of just like the other, like people who speak English. So I am culturally defined more than I am physically defined. So to recap simply, what I can say is, A, biological race just does not exist. That the category of race that is used by cultures is constructed by cultures, and they construct their conception of race based on their own history. So that in the United States, for example, the three racial categories, the broadest ones, that is European, African, and Asian, are a historical product of European immigration coupled with slavery and some kind of servitude by Asians in the West. That's historically how the racial categories are formed. And in other cultures, as I mentioned, like Argentina or Cambodia, they're going to have different racial categories because they have different histories. And those racial categories are constructed based on those histories. And so are the prejudices. Like the prejudice against African Americans by white Americans is based on the history of slavery, and so on. So it's not just a question of how you classify people, but what kind of hierarchy you put them in. But it's all dependent on the culture in which you're raised. All right, well, maybe, I don't know whether that clarifies things or not. I hope it does. I hope it makes it clear that race, even though it's not a biological fact, is still is still real. Social facts are real. They're just like money is real and can do real things. Social conceptions of race are as real as anything else that has physical existence. So I'm going to move into different territory on Tuesday. May even get back to cooking, I don't know. Meanwhile, please like, subscribe, and I will see you on Tuesday.